So you've covered a couple of the points that I was going to start with, so I'll just briefly introduce some of the things that I'm currently working on. As Manuela mentioned, I'm going to be joining the team of the New Reel at the University of Edinburgh. And the project explores how the design of festival experiences fueled by artificial intelligence can equip cultural organizations to engage audiences in what we call the New Reel. The New Reel has so far commissioned artworks by Jake Elwes, Anna Ridler, and Caroline Sinders, who are all showing work here in the festival. They've also launched a pilot experience called Awen, A Walk Encountering Nature. Our mission with the New Reel is to build awareness and understanding of the ways data systems and AI reflect and shape our social reality, to quote the project director, Drew Hemmant. So these concerns resonate very much with the work I've done in my PhD, and today's presentation and a great deal of my previous work draws from my background in media archaeology. Media archaeology seeks to better understand contemporary media artifacts and contexts in relation to longer historical tendencies that shape and inform them. So for example, we may look at early precursor technologies to those of photography and cinema in order to gain a better understanding of how those are manifested today. For example, in the slide shown here, Abelardo Morel creates and documents rooms that he's turned into camera obscura, using an early projection technique that adds to the meaning of the artist's photographs. By adopting what Siegfried Zielinski calls a deep time perspective of media, the approach of media archaeology allows us to draw insights from artifacts from the distant past, in contrast with the common tendency to exclusively consider technology in terms of the new. Dead media is a term commonly associated with media archaeology and best known for its use in Bruce Sterling's Dead Media project. But I'll note that it's a bit antithetical to my own perspective on media. It mostly refers to antiquated or obsolete technology that's no longer used, such as many devices of pre-cinema, but I've also heard it applied to pretty much anything that no longer feels new. So the tendency to treat technology as if it quickly expires stands out as highly problematic for a number of reasons, including the unsustainable toll this has from an ecological perspective. So I'd like to dig into this a bit and try to unpack technical novelty and its accelerationist tendencies, especially in relation to art contexts. Technical novelty may play a significant role in public reception of media and artistic projects, especially those engaged with science and technology. While this is a strategy that often succeeds in quickly gaining notoriety, it doesn't necessarily hold up to the test of time or contribute meaningfully or sustainably to art and discourse. Looking at the history of media and technology, there have been many instances in which the new has been used to mystify technologies or technical processes, often while seeking short-term commercial gains. And while the use of the new itself is not really a new phenomenon, it remains a significant factor, at least in the early phases of cultural explorations with technology. So I'd like to look at a few recent and historic examples of how novelty has been instrumentalized over a longer period. I'll especially focus on instances involving machine learning and the larger narratives around artificial intelligence because of my own research background and the current relevance of those topics. So this is intended as an exploration and a bit of a rough sketch, trying to ground our perspective of the new and how it's used as a tool to sell things, literally or figuratively speaking, and to help us reflect critically on what this means in a wider context. So this image is, if you can see it, is an example I like quite a lot as an illustration of how changing perceptions of technology and its novelty affect the way that media artifacts are received. It's one of a series of photographs produced by two young girls, Elsie Wright and Frances Griffith, in the early part of the 20th century, known as the Cottingley Fairies incident. So the photos show the girls interacting with fairies, which the girls had made out of paper. But when these photos were published, they caused a bit of a sensation, and there was at least a degree of public discussion over whether these were indeed genuine. And they notably convinced Sir Arthur Conan Doyle that these photographs were evidence of the existence of fairies. The situation highlights the suspension of disbelief that is often applied to new technologies. So before photography, its processes and its limitations were widely accessible to non-experts, there was more room for people to question their own grasp of what the technology was in fact capable of. And this left even unlikely outcomes, like taking photographs of fairies, slightly less doubtful than perhaps in other circumstances. And although the Cottingley Fairies incident may seem a bit absurd to us today, we may also be able to see that that distinction seems to have been a bit less clear a century ago than it is now. So even though it's quite different, the hype around artificial intelligence and machine learning in recent years also demonstrates how the perceived novelty of a technology can be used as a marketing tool. Searching the internet for images using the term artificial intelligence tends to return a lot of images that look like the one I'm showing on the screen, taking quite a lot of liberties with the mythology that's been built up around AI. So an infamous instance of this is the sale of an image called The Portrait of Edmond de Belmy by the Christie's auction house in 2018, which they credited to an algorithm rather than the group of people responsible for creating it. The work was widely panned in artistic contexts as a marketing stunt to drive up the price of a picture that lacked artistic merit, yet it sold at auction for far above the expected price. And this example is already a bit old, but even now I frequently see other examples, even by very respected people, where public lack of understanding of how AI works has been used to push forward fairly dubious projects, especially those pushing the narrative of AI as an autonomous artist. So before we go further into AI and machine learning, I'll just give a quick overview of what I mean by these and some related terms. Artificial intelligence has been defined by prominent researchers in the field as a branch of computer science that studies the properties of intelligence by synthesizing intelligence. And though it's become somewhat synonymous with machine learning, AI is distinguished from it as being a broader field and concept within which machine learning is situated. So to use Melanie Mitchell's definition, which I quite like, machine learning is a subfield of artificial intelligence in which machines learn from data or their own experiences. AI is also differentiated from AGI, or artificial general intelligence, which according to Wikipedia is the hypothetical ability of an intelligent agent to understand or learn any intellectual task that a human can perform. So this is the meaning of AI that's popular to anthropomorphize as threatening to become autonomous and to destroy the world. But many of the problems with this kind of depiction is that one of the many problems of it is that it actually glosses over some of the very real and present dangers of AI that originate from humans and not from the systems themselves. Besides the fact that that experts in AI insist that AGI is far from becoming a reality anytime soon, many projects have latched onto this mythologized idea of artificial intelligence and the AI artist as an enduring trope. And I would say that Andreas Brockman has pointed out in his article, The Machine as Artist as Myth, that this idea of the machine artist is actually in itself very far from new. But even beyond this mythologization of machines assuming authorship as artists, there's also quite a lot of work similar to the work of, for example, Mario Klingemann, where sometimes quite underwhelming artworks are made using machine learning, but marketed merely for their association with artificial intelligence. So far from being exclusive to AI, this phenomenon is just a current trend or manifestation comparable to other fads and overhyped trends in art and technology that have occurred in the past. One example of this is the fictions of virtuality from the early days of the internet, which are far less common now and also far less convincing. And for example, works that have been highly innovative at the time they were created, they may appear quite dated when we look back on them. Another thing I'm quite interested in is artists working with formats, programming languages or protocols that cease to be widespread. And these bring up other issues, such as how galleries or museums can show archival materials long after they're created, and when it may not be possible to run them in the original manner that they were composed for. Patricia Falcao from the Tate has been doing some really interesting research into this topic and looking at how institutions can archive file-based contemporary artworks. Artists also sometimes work with older formats intentionally to play on this history and work with the changing meaning of those media. So there's a tradition of discussing art as having a certain timelessness and an ability to touch on something beyond itself that exceeds its particular context. But in what we might call media art, or art that not only uses technology, but also reflects upon and addresses the technological conditions of its own existence, the techniques and technologies that are employed and the way that those are used often play a significant role in the intended interpretation of the work. So not all technical elements are necessarily integral or meaningful within a work. So while it's actually interesting from an archival point of view, it also raises a lot of difficult to answer philosophical and artistic questions. So we might ask ourselves, for example, which parts of a work can be treated as significant to the meaning of a work, and which may be treated as interchangeable or possible to update with new technology. The answer to this question is often very subjective and open to interpretations of artistic intention, as well as being highly variable from one work to another. So to put all of this in perspective, I'd like to read an anecdote from Laurent Manon's The Great Art of Light and Shadow, Archaeology of the Cinema. So after the appearance of Magia Naturalis, the science of optics became one of the favorite recreations of nobility and scholars, and one of the most desirable accessories for acrobats and conjurers. So this book was published in 1558 by Giovanni Battista della Porta, and in this book he detailed the optical principles involved in the magic lantern, which became a very, very popular public spectacle. So for the commoners of the 16th century who had not read Magia Naturalis, the sudden projection of a devil or wild animals onto the screen of the camera obscura would remain for some time a phenomenon that was inexplicable and therefore supernatural. A new resource was opened up for quacks and tricksters. Not long after the book's publication, it was possible for an individual initiated into its mystery to profit from the more or less general ignorance of the world at large in optical matters, presenting shows of magic and sorcery, whose sole aim was to extort money from gullible spectators. So to give this a bit of context, according to Manoni, projections and optical toys created a new trade. The peddler or showman, traveling with a magic lantern or peep show, often on their back. It was the trade of paupers, generating miserably low earnings. These traveling lanternists moved between towns and villages with their show carried on a back strapped to their back. So, but while the magic lantern and fraudulent lanternists had their heyday, within 100 years, the magic lantern had fallen so out of fashion that a prominent inventor wrote the following of his father's requests that he construct his father a magic lantern. Here is another commission which my father has given me to arrange for him a lantern with 2 or 3 different kinds of pictures to be shown with it. You would not believe the difficulty with which I occupy myself with such trifles, which already seem quite old to me, and in addition, I am ashamed that people will know that they came from me. So the speed at which technologies and fads that surround them has accelerated quite drastically since the time that the magic lantern was fashionable. But something that remains similar is the rapid expiration of technological gimmicks. What I mainly want to point out is that relying on the novelty of a technology to prop up, to validate, to legitimize art often ends up being a short-sighted pitfall. So much like the distinction between art, bad art, and non-art, the distinction between using technology in art and attempting to present it as a novelty, as art, or as the justification of art, is a highly subjective and complex to navigate territory. So in this talk, I wanted to problematize novelty in media art contexts, precisely because I don't think that there are any straightforward answers. Yet it's a very integral issue to technologically engaged art. So I thought I'd end this presentation with a provocation of several open questions that I hope can prompt discussion about more sustainable perspectives on art and technology. When is a new technology just a gimmick? When is it an integral element in a work of art? And what comes after novelty? Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Rosemary. I have now an idea, because Michelle Thorne unfortunately cannot come, and we have a lot to discuss. There have been a lot of questions. Maybe, Rosemary, you go back to your questions. And if it's okay for you, I mean, we have so great persons here in the audience. I would ask Alessandro to come to the stage. I would like to ask Gerda Palmetzhofer to come to the stage. Yeah, you have a lot to say on this topic, I'm sure. I would like to ask Andreas Zingerle. He is hiding somewhere, but I just found, so yeah, come. Please do not hide. I would like to ask also one of the students. I don't want to be rude and just so, okay, now, please, some of the students, is it possible that you also come to the stage? We have here Noah, we have here Christina, we have Sarah, we have, please come. So if you, I think you also can contribute to these questions, okay? From a very, very, very young point of view. And I have to bridge 30 minutes now, so I'm really, really happy that, woo! Yes! We have a spontaneous roundtable here, a very spontaneous roundtable. And I'm really, really happy to have Christina Tika, interface culture student, now in the second, actually third year now, third semester coming up. We have Andreas Zingerle, a very well-known artist, researcher, Austrian, even Linz. I mean, not Linz-based anymore, but actually coming from the Linz area, right? Innsbruck? Okay, sorry. No, not Linz, but Innsbruck, Austria, okay? Very well known with his exhibitions that he's doing, with his research that he's representing. He will come to this then afterwards. Gerda Palmetzhofer, very, very important in the context of Linz when we speak about policy making, when we speak about communities. And Alessandro Ludovico, artist, researcher, working since very long time also with Paolo Siri together, actually also professor at, I'm not prepared now, professor? Sorry? Just the School of Art, okay. Okay, we have now these questions. When is a new technology just a gimmick? When it is an integral element in the work of art? And what does it mean, like speaking after novelty? Who wants to start? And I mean, of course, you as an audience, please contribute, yeah? I mean, you're also invited, but I was thinking there are really very, very important persons that, of course, have to say something.
Well, I guess I'll start because I started it. And I want to apologize to each of you for implicating you in this trouble with novelty, but I'm very, very thankful that you are game to play around with this with me. Yeah, so I've been struggling with these issues, and I thought I would just bring them here to kind of throw them on the table without providing answers, and so yeah, I don't know, maybe I can just riff on why I find that interesting, especially in this context, because all of us are working with art and technology in some way, and we, you know, as in doing that, we really need to consider our medium, and we need to consider the context that we work in, and yeah, things expire for sure. Like things change, protocols change, ways of doing things change, and we get tired of things, and that's also part of, you know, life and art and everything else. But I think this disposability of certain, like treating technology as a novelty, I think has a way of making it maybe expire faster or making it very disposable, and that I really, you know, I don't have any solutions to, but I think it would be nice to, yeah, if you guys have any.
So I would like briefly to refer to the term of hype cycle, and yet I also want to apologize. I haven't been here from the beginning of the lecture, so in case I'm just repeating something, apologies. I guess as many novelties, many technologies, whether come under, well, suffer because of this phenomenon. So after the sequences of fascination, of exploring possibilities, whether it's about industries or arts, I think it can really refer to art and how artists experience new technologies. It does somehow resonate with the hype cycle. So it's always, it's of course hard to predict what technologies will become sort of obsolete, but since art is pretty much individual and very personal practice, I believe that some things always stay in place. And with popularity, and when things are raising up, it is very tricky also I'm talking from background of being an artist and a fine artist before I turned more towards new media or interactive or machine learning and computer vision. So I'm kind of going through that experience, exploring how then we see what the machines see, etc., etc. For me, it was important to start addressing all of the issues that come in like epistemology of such technologies, of teleology of how is it being used, how does it work, and rather than just to be like fascinated with, oh, look how interesting things this thing does. Like, yes, okay, it is amazing, but let's try to hack it, let's try to break it, let's try to see what is in its core that will surpass that first encounter with that first fascination. So as long as, in my opinion, as long as artists take that role seriously to kind of excavate the essential aspects of, the medium, as it was maybe with painting, as it was with sculpting and different materials. I also believe that technology has its own essence, its own poetics, its own structures, its own tools dictate some things. They give some limitations, but they also open up new languages. And it's just, I think, always important to have that in mind. So I hope I wasn't too vague in this, but to somehow give a continuation from one perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what you said, and I also think like when we see, for example, the realist paintings and what is done nowadays with accumulation of data and visualization of this data and trying to find or to see the perspective of a more evidence-driven realism. I think that it adds new aesthetics, new ways of seeing the world. But I would not say in that way that technology remains just a gimmick. It's also in a way of how do you, what do you actually use it for, and how do you break it or push the boundaries of it in a way.
Yeah, from my point of view, I think I want to bring up two moments and combining them in the following sentences. Yes, the first thing is for me, novelty will arise when Renaissance was beginning. So in philosophical terms, there has been this kind of shift of thinking in categories in a way that they were split. So like topos was once a space and a place, and then they began to separate all those things, yes. And this was this kind of a little bit of a multi-perspective in a way within the Renaissance itself, I think. And we can see this movement at the beginning of the 20th century with all this montage and collage and cubism and all this artist thinking. So, and for me this was a kind of forerunner in art history to have this kind of, but then we were facing with deep anthropological shift, like Clarisse Herrenschmidt once was splitting up this kind of 3 écritures. The ones when you are just making signs into the claim, then when you're inventing alphabet, and then when you're just moving to code at the same time, when you're leaving precious metal and investing Nasdaq. So underlying of all artists' thinking, which does have a kind of autonomy itself, it's a parallel movement in economic thinking. And so, yes, these were my thoughts, and I think this is already new, that we have a complete new écriture. So I think we cannot really handle it at the moment, because there is too much of what is technological driven, and the artistic standing with this kind of impartially deep movement what an artist is doing is lacking sometimes, yeah.
Actually, there are plenty of questions just automatically generated without any artificial intelligence from them, from the ones that you posed. I mean, the first one about being a gimmick, it implies, of course, the neutrality or not on the technology. Is it neutral? So whenever we use any kind of technology, is neutral, or it already implies something when we use it. And I mean, it will take quite a bit of time, of course, to unpack it, but I'm more passionate about the second one. When is it an integral element in a work of art? I have one personal experience that you were mentioning before. We developed the trilogy, 3 works which were quite deeply rooted in software and the use of networks. But at the same time, the challenge was that the concept would have been realized even without computers and without the networks. Of course, in many years, decades. I don't know how to estimate that. But it was obviously possible because it was just elaboration of information and transmission of information that could have been done manually. So, and then I'm starting to wonder myself, where then those technologies were an integral element in that work of art. It's difficult to answer. Because I could say, yes, they were, because without those technology, the speed to realize the project would have been even too long to ever complete. But also not. They were not, because we could do it manually as well. So, I mean, I would like to also to mention something about the media archaeology perspective, because of course this is strictly related to media archaeology in terms of, okay, how we will preserve these works for the future. We will preserve just the concept that could be done manually or with advanced technologies or with the technologies that were available at that time, which is another big problem. I mean, Bruce Sterling in its speech at the Museum of Modern Art in San Francisco with its Dead Media Project, he says something that I found quite enlightening somehow when we talk about new technologies. He says, for the first time in history, we have work of arts old enough, but we can still talk to the artist. The artist is not dead yet. So he can also decide, he should have a voice in saying how we want to preserve these works of art. And I think that that opens then a discussion, which is for me particularly interesting, which is, I mean, we can connect then what the artist thinks about the preservation of his work, which implies what the artist thinks about the technology being an integral element or not, and what the artist thinks about the technology being neutral or not, or absolutely essential. Even if, all in all, as you have shown I mean, in different slides, all the technologies become obsolete very quickly. And the struggle to keep them alive in a way, I mean, all the museums who have embraced this impossible task to preserve media art, we all know media artworks are really struggling with the last computer of that specific kind, or things like that. All in all, I started to think, after quite a few years, actually, I have to confess, to be part of a research group about media archaeology, probably. Don't know about that, but I was started to think, okay, but shouldn't we just surrender to the fact that technology becomes obsolete just faster than something else? That, I mean, everything starts to corrupt and die. And with technology, it's just more devastating and quicker than everything else. Of course, I don't want to add more questions to yours, but...
Oh, that's great. I feel like we could stay here until very late at night just with that. Do I have time for? Okay. I have just tiny. I have so many stories and thoughts and things that I would love to share, but I will just choose one and share that. But so Patricia Falcao, who I had a slide showing her. And I mentioned, so she has been doing this really interesting research with the Tate about how they can archive file-based artworks. And she told me a really nice story about how she was working with an artist who was still alive, but quite old. And his work, therefore, was very, very old. And they wanted to show this installation with a lot of projection, but it had been done with like the world's oldest digital projector, and they had this discussion with him about whether, whether it was, integral to the work of art that they used, the originals, and the Tate actually wanted to use all the original technology to show this kind of archivalness, like the gigantic pixels and everything of these projections. And the artist was like, no, like I want the finest new projector that you can get me, and like we're going to change everything out. And they ended up in this kind of discrepancy about, the artist completely disagrees with how the museum thinks that it should be, and they both have like kind of good arguments for why this is important. And then, who should win, the artist who made it, or, the one who has acquired it and is trying to take care of it. And I think it's really situational, like it can be really, really different from context to context. And I think that those questions get even more complicated when an artist dies and, you don't have anyone to ask. And then you just have to interpret all of this stuff. Yeah, so that's just my thought on that. Any other thoughts? I think we're good.
Maybe I'm overwhelming you a little bit, Andreas, but this life beyond death media we already had in the presentation also of the Kipu. And you did this wonderful exhibition where you actually were collecting all these equipment with very personal archives of people, actually dying equipment, dying hardware that was actually already supposed to be on exactly. And I think this is maybe a nice comment for you, how artists are actually then also working with this actually dead media.
Well, that media, it was more like discarded hard drives, I think what you are referring to. So in that sense, maybe information that was not considered valuable anymore to the owner and was then kind of reanimated and repurposed, recollaged by a group of artists and then shown in different setups and different exhibitions. But yeah, with the Kipu, I don't know what you were referring to. That was a different work? Okay. All right, okay. Yeah.
I think I owe you all a beer for this very spontaneous round table. Thank you very much for just taking this possibility to react to this question, even though you were not prepared to it. So wonderful that you are actually here. Is anybody in the audience who still want to reply? Yeah, Martin.
Thanks, Rosemary. Really fascinating presentation. My question is, bringing it back to AI, bringing it back to novelty, and the question that's not on the screen now, what comes after novelty? I wonder what comes immediately after novelty, because it's not obsolescence or dead media. It's probably more something like mainstreaming and boredom, or the everyday, or something like that. And in an AI context, that's potentially a very problematic space into which a technology might slip, right? Like that's when the ideological undercurrents that we all associate with AI related to surveillance or control regimes or so forth might become invisible. So something that is to be said in favor of novelty, I think, is visibility and a certain type of attention and focus that it attracts. So maybe that's also a provocative notion from my end, that maybe there is something to be said in favor of holding on to novelty in an art-making context, because it can then be maybe much more easily mobilized critically for artists. I don't know.
No, that's a really great question, and I definitely don't want to say that I don't hate the new and I don't hate the novel, and I think that novelty is something that gets us engaged and gets us talking about things, and that we, you know, it's the exciting part, and I think you're really spot on with what you pointed out, that like it's kind of like, you know, having an outfit that is just slightly out of fashion. And then you get this discomfort of like, I kind of know it too well, but I kind of still love it, but it's kind of, you know, I'm a little embarrassed to love it still. And I don't know, I feel like it's a kind of nice, nicely parallel emotional connection that we have to newness or oldness. But I really think maybe the word, like in answer to what comes directly after novelty, is complacency, because we're starting to have AI in contexts and situations where it's not super novel anymore, and we're not excited, and we're not worried. You know, we're not as worried, or we still don't totally get, you know, there's still so much that we don't understand about it, but yet it doesn't, yeah, I don't know, it's not like the hot thing. So yeah, I think you're really right that it's not black and white, and it's very, very, very nuanced and very, it's not as if something is like new and now it's not. It's, there's so many gradients that go in there.
Thank you very much. I owe you all a beer or a drink. Please go to the bar. I just heard also from my partners here that because Michelle Thorne, I already mentioned, she was actually supposed to talk now, but we have got a link with a presentation from her online, and this is now what we're going to see. Because when we speak about what comes after novelty, we also have to take into account when we speak about our climate, when we speak about resources, when we speak about artists, how to use resources. And this is exactly now the topic of Michelle Thorne, actually, and her Branch magazine. Let me quickly introduce Michelle Thorne, even though she's not here, and even though she cannot present it personally. Hopefully she can come then after 7 o'clock at least for a private discussion between you and her, and because actually she owes you a beer. No, but it's actually the Deutsche Bahn who is the problem here. Let me quickly introduce to you Michelle Thorne. So, Michelle Thorne is interested in climate justice and the fossil... Yeah, you can of course leave if you want. So, thank you so much. Thank you so much. Please, there's the bar. Yes, yeah, a big applause. Yeah, it was really totally spontaneous. I just saw them and thank you very much. Michelle Thorne is interested in climate justice and fossil-free internet. As a senior program officer at the Mozilla Foundation, Michelle leads a PhD program on open design of just things with Norumba University and research initiatives in Mozilla's sustainability program. Michelle publishes Branch, an online magazine written by and for people who dream about a sustainable internet, and she is recipient of the Ars Electronica Award for Digital Humanity. She's an advisor for the Green Web Foundation and the Billion Seconds Institute. She also has co-founded a sustainable fashion label, Zephyr Berlin. Michelle contributed to the creation of Mozilla Common Voice, now the world's largest multilingual public domain voice dataset, and she's a member of Climate Action Tech, a network of tech workers accelerating climate action, and a thinker in residence at Climate KIC. Michelle founded Mozilla's Open Internet of Things Studio, Ding Magazine, the Mozilla Festival, and a web literacy program called Maker Party. Michelle managed the Creative Commons International Affiliate Network from 2007 to 2010. And now we are very proud to have the video from Michelle. It's about 10 minutes, and then we are following with, again, a Sound Campus intervention, and then the Keylecture from Martin Zeilinger, so please stay.
Has been taken from us, and let's take it back and build together better. Oh, yeah, here, let's go imagine, explore, and build together. First acknowledgement that, the climate crisis is not a single issue. It's an era that cuts across everything that we are and will experience. It's changing everything, and we can no longer compartmentalize this issue. And with that in mind, I'd like to share some provocations with you all. So, acknowledging that both technology is political, and that it also requires human labor, natural resources, and more to build, let's think about what it would be to make visible the true cost of technology. Oftentimes, technology, especially AI, is used to abstract and extract, as the researcher Kate Crawford describes. How could we be making this more visible? So, the real cost of technology isn't happening far away or out of sight, out of mind. Some sort of inspiration for that, I wanted to share a map that Kate Crawford made together with Vladan Joler, called Anatomy of an AI System. And what they did is they took an Amazon Alexa and they wanted to make a kind of super exploded view of what are the human and material costs that go into actually making this object. Not just the mining and production and smelting of the materials and the hardware, but also the data collection, the content moderation, the advertising, all the way down to the very end, the afterlife of and recycling of these objects. These are huge and complex systems, and oftentimes that's extracted away if you just see, an Amazon Echo on a table somewhere. And what I find also fascinating about this chart, which is also, or this map, and why it's great and political, is that you can see, starting at the bottom, the people who are paid the least and probably exploited the most in these systems, child miners, like literally digging up, minerals, to the very, very top of this particular extraction pyramid, who's Jeff Bezos, the richest person on earth. I think this is an example of how we might try, or just one example of many of how we might try to make visible the true costs of technology. Another provocation I wanted to share was around how can we make a carbon-aware internet? In case you don't know, the internet is responsible for at least 2% of the world's carbon emissions. That's more than the aviation industry. And we only see the footprint of the internet growing as internet usage and datification grows. So I wanted to share this provocation because I find that sometimes when we talk about these issues, people go into a real binary mode. It's either, full on all tech, all fires blazing, or some sort of like monkish minimalism. And I actually think there's a space for some webbiness and responsiveness in how we approach these issues. So I wanted to share one approach we used in a magazine that I helped make called Branch Magazine, where we explored with the idea of, can your website respond to the actual grid intensity of your current internet connection? So we wired up with an API that helps to explain, is your internet connection currently running on high renewables, medium level mix of renewables, or only on fossil fuels? And depending on your specific internet connection, we can serve up different versions of a website. So the more renewables you have, the richer the data is of the website, down to when you're running on a lot of fossil fuels, we're just showing you text. And I think this way of playing kind of with a spectrum or this responsiveness becomes also a lot more interesting and a lot more true to the kinds of resourcing we're going to see on our grid and in our networks. And similarly, I wanted to share the amazing project from Tika Brain and others called Solar Protocol. And this is basically, a website that's hosted across a network of solar-powered servers. And this network decides where is the sun shining the most, and it serves you up that website. It serves up the website from which servers are getting the most sunshine. I think this is also a really great way to start to also make visible the natural resources we need to power the internet. And what I also like about the Solar Protocol project is they bring in also the idea of stewardship. They have server stewards who are, helping you understand and see in context the physical infrastructure that's running the websites. The last provocation would be, we're talking about huge issues, the climate crisis, AI, the internet. These are incredibly big and sometimes very abstract topics. So here, another provocation is maybe take something that's so big and let's make it really small. This is a project I did together with Gabby Ivins. We made a tiny miniature museum called the Museum of the Fossilized Internet. And the idea was that you're entering a museum from the future, from the year 2050, and we're kind of looking back on today and the internet of 2020 and going, like, gasping at the horrors of, a coal-powered internet. And what we did was we made little tiny miniatures of some of the major polluters online. So there's a little tiny Bitcoin mining rig, there's tiny VR sets, and Netflix streaming, and AI training data, and all these ways that we're trying to talk about these really big and complex and sometimes very distant feeling issues and try to make them small, and using a kind of craftivist approach of slowing down, making something tactile, making something with care, and kind of, it yielded other kinds of conversations because we made something in this, you know, in a very different medium. So I wanted to share those 3 provocations with you all. And lastly, kind of conclude with this, with some inspiration from the solar punks, who, as I said at the beginning, are really talking about taking back optimism, and I think taking it back with a set of really compelling values, like really centering this work on social justice, on a sustainable internet, and of the idea that we can do and build things together, and that we don't have to only go down the cynical and pessimistic route. And that, you know, to quote the amazing Black feminist Todi Cade Mambara, we should be striving to make the revolution irresistible. We know that things need to change. Let's try to make that irresistible, desirable and irresistible. And some small ways to kind of plug into some ways of, at least I've been thinking about this. I've mentioned Branch Magazine, which I warmly welcome you to check out. And for people who are interested in dreaming of a sustainable internet, these are some approaches that we're exploring together, as well as the amazing Climate Action Tech, which Andy helped found, and you'll find a really great community of people who are, especially coming from the tech sector, interested in how to use their expertise towards climate action, and really learning a lot together. And yeah, let's dream, let's build. I hope you have a really great event, and hope you build some wonderful things. And thank you all so much for your time. Great night.
Woo! Yes! And he's curator based in Scotland, where he works as a senior lecturer in computational arts and technology at Abertay University. Research focuses on artistic and activist experimentation with emerging technologies. Tactical Entanglements, a monograph on AI art, creative agency and the limits of intellectual property. Da-da-da-da, here is the book. Was just published, I have to say. When was it published? 6 weeks ago. Was just published with Maison Press. Martin's work on digital art in relation to AI and/or blockchain is widely available in books, including Artists Rethinking the Blockchain and Molylab Reader 2, and published forthcoming in journals such as Philosophy and Technology, Culture Machine, Leonardo, and Media Theory. Welcome, Martin Zeilinger.
Try again? Okay. Thanks for the introduction. Manu, also, thank you very much for facilitating the invitation and having me here. Yes, I am from Linz, but I have left many, many years ago, and so that makes it a lot more exciting even to come back for this context. Yeah, this book just came out. This is not a book presentation, and I'm not really talking very closely about things from the book. But I'm touching on it tangentially, and there's a few copies, and if somebody wants one, I'll make you a good price. Which, without further ado, I'll jump right in. Early in the afternoon, it was so bright in this courtyard that I thought I better make my slides really high contrast and take out most of the images. Now actually, it looks like it could have been okay with more images in. But here we go. So I'll be talking about artificial intelligence and machine learning most generally, and more specifically about artists who approach these technologies in what I like to call a tactical mode of operation, and who do so in ways that I feel are useful for thinking through problems of bias and agency, specifically in relation to the issue of algorithmic adjudication. And so these are the two concepts that will tie this discussion together for me today. The first one being algorithmic adjudication, by which most generally I mean the outsourcing of decision-making processes to computational agency. And the second term, the second concept being what I will describe a little later on as bias contagion. As you will see, partly this talk is also a bit of a meditation on terminologies and sensibilities of the pandemic. Maybe this is unavoidable. It's thought-provoking and useful. Maybe this is also because this is the first time I'm traveling internationally in quite some time. So I'm speaking from the really strong conviction that in the context of critical data, digital art has some very, very important roles to play. And these roles are complex, they're multifaceted, they're dynamic. They have to do with experimentation, with delineating and pushing limits, and with formulating critical positions outside of the cultural mainstream. So one of the important roles in my mind that artistic experimentation with AI has is to resist this illusory idea of a kind of pure innovation, which in my mind always just really kind of seeks to assimilate experimentation into the so-called creative industries. Another role is to interrogate the corporate mainstreaming and commercialization of emerging AI technologies. And this is something that's been discussed a little bit already today. And then a third role for me would be to expose the integration of AI technologies into various kinds of governmental and policy-oriented control regimes. Ultimately, what this adds up for me is a fostering of critical literacy of data in digital culture more broadly. In a book that came out about 2 years ago, Nick Dyer-Witherford and two co-authors formulated this really dark notion that AI possesses a kind of inhuman power, and that with this power, AI may soon maybe end up emancipating capital from humanity, rather than the other way around. In other words, these authors frame AI as a fundamentally capitalist technology. Without doubt, that is an important position, an important perspective. But what I'm additionally interested in is exploring what I would call tactical uses of AI that actually work against commodification, corporate black boxing, and propertization. So while Dyer-Witherford highlights the inhuman quality of AI, the work of AI artists very often actually shows precisely the human dimensions of artificial intelligence. For example, in exposing biased data labeling labor, or also the human agency that remains involved in designing all kinds of algorithmic processes. So my point is not at all that AI should work with anthropocentric perspectives, or that it should anthropomorphize AI. Instead, my point is that it is only by holding on to human agency in AI contexts that we can also enter maybe into new and very interesting kinds of post-humanist agential entanglements with AI. In the context of art making and digital culture, questions about agency and about the human qualities of AI, for me, play out maybe most interestingly in relation to issues of creative expression and authorship. And this is really also very much what my research is about. So, what does it really mean in the context of AI-driven art making to create something? Who or what is a creative agent in AI contexts? What is originality in the context of AI-driven art? And by extension, what does it mean in the context of AI-based art making to be an author or an artist? And then from this question, we're really just a very small step away also from asking what cultural ownership really can mean in the context of AI. So what is intellectual property in an AI context? What does it mean to own something in the age of AI? Let me go on to connect this introduction to some of the problematic implications of algorithmic adjudication. I already defined a little bit what I mean by algorithmic adjudication. It's most generally the outsourcing of decision-making processes to computational agency. And a starting point for thinking about this a lot more would be the really excellent work of Antoinette Rouvroy on algorithmic governmentality, or in algorithmic governance. So in digital art and AI contexts, a focus on algorithmic adjudication can, for example, lead us to the following problem. If there are concerns about who authored an artwork, or about whether an artwork is original, or also about whether the copying and recirculation of an artwork is legitimate, can these questions be adjudicated algorithmically? Can these questions be answered by an AI system? Now let me give you an example to illustrate what I mean here. The example is a tool called Content ID, which many of you probably have had exposure to in some form. Content ID is an AI-driven digital rights management tool that is used to enforce the copyright policy of the YouTube online video platform. Essentially what it does is to compare uploads to entries in a really gigantic database of copyright-protected content that Google has put together. And then this Content ID tool makes the deliberations about whether or not the upload infringes any of those copyrights of the materials contained in this database. So Content ID is designed on the belief that an artwork must be characterized by uniqueness and singular authorship. Everything that looks or sounds or behaves like something else in the database cannot be an original artwork. And can therefore also, in this very limited functionality of Content ID, it can therefore also not be a legitimate artwork. So the system is designed to flag and remove presumptively infringing media uploads by enforcing this assumption that creative agency is incontrovertibly linked to ownership by way of singular authorship. And by enforcing this view algorithmically, Content ID helps to kind of integrate all the uploads into the property-oriented media ecology of YouTube. The tool enforces a very restrictive and narrow perspective on what expressive agency is and can be, and what ownership consequently is. And from the user perspective, this ends up translating into a bias against some of the most interesting, to my mind, characteristics of creativity, such as the fact that it is hugely relational, dialogic, socially embedded, and not at all about singular artist figures or the unique existence of single artworks. So this is what I would describe as bias contagion, the way in which users of YouTube are inevitably habituated to the very restrictive ideas about cultural ownership and copyright that result from the algorithmic adjudication of the Content ID tool. Bias contagion really refers to the way in which bias can spread through networks and communities by way of algorithmic processes. But in theory, copyright law actually aspires to accommodate this complexity of creativity. Its relational and dialogic and socially embedded nature. For example, almost everywhere in the world, the concepts of fair use and fair dealing actually form exceptions to copyright restrictions. And they are designed to allow creative practices of copying and sharing and reusing for all kinds of purposes, such as criticism or parody. In other words, in theory, the law tries to accommodate the complexity of creativity by acknowledging that our understanding of creative agency actually relies on all kinds of shared cultural norms. But algorithmic adjudication relies actually not on these socially shared norms, but on executable binary rule systems, not on norms. So in the law, copyright exceptions that permit copying and reusing exist in the form of very complex norms and standards that are flexible and context sensitive and purposefully lack clarity, so that human critical thinking and intervention is required every time to make an informed decision about whether or not something being copied from an original is actually a legitimate purpose of copying that thing. Now, unfortunately, an algorithmic adjudication tool like Content ID inevitably flattens and simplifies these complex standards and norms into computable rules. Otherwise, the system just doesn't work at all. So in my view, what this indicates is that in the context of algorithmic adjudication, we're witnessing a shift away from enacting new kinds of non-human agency in AI, and very often, of course, that's the promise of creative AI or of AI art. And instead, we see a move towards enforcing human non-agency through AI, through tools such as Content ID. Okay, after this long preliminary discussion, let me contextualize this with artistic experimentation with AI. In the example of Content ID, the system spreads and reinforces kind of a self-perpetuating, self-amplifying bias that favors very old-fashioned, outdated notions of authorship and cultural ownership. But artistic experiments with AI can actually, I believe, mobilize this process of bias contagion differently for critical purposes, precisely in a mode that I would describe as tactical. I derived this concept a little bit from Rita Riley's notion of tactical media, which doesn't really seem to have a lot of purchase in media art contexts anymore. But I take it much more so from Michel Desserteau and his theorization of the distinction between strategic and tactical modes of operation. According to Desserteau, strategy serves administrative purposes, managerial purposes. It serves capitalist agendas very often. And it does so by drawing on system-inherent control architectures, very often with the purpose of shutting down critical or divergent elements that might exist within a system. And by contrast, tactical modes of practice represent a kind of much more open-ended resistance that oftentimes emerges within a system. In this sense, tactical AI is likely to resist strategic approaches that would tend to, in AI contexts, would tend to black box knowledge, close off access, or reinforce very narrow conceptualizations of agency. So what I'd be interested in thinking about further is whether bias contagion can manifest as more than merely a problem in strategic deployment of AI. In other words, how can we think of bias contagion as a tactical maneuver? So I want to say a few words about this very interesting AI art installation that I also talk about a lot in the book, by Canadian artist Adam Bazanta, and the project is called All We'd Ever Need Is One Another. And what this project does is, in my mind, really beautifully expose the absurdity of rule-driven copyright enforcement, of the kind of algorithmic adjudication that Content ID, for example, executes. So what this installation, what this art project is about, is essentially a system of, or a setup of tabletop flatbed scanners that are set up in such a way that they scan very abstract light patterns that are reflecting off of their surfaces. It's a fully randomized system. The artist has really no agency in controlling what the scans look like. So it's a very carefully designed system that shields itself from the purposeful kind of artistic intervention of the artist himself, very much for the purpose of being able to claim this as a fully autonomous kind of art factory. And that's also how the artist describes this, as an art factory. That's the first part. The very important second part is that there's an AI-based tool built into this that compares the scans that the system generates by itself, compares these scans to images of existing artworks that it can find online. And when it finds a match, it follows this convention from appropriation art to name the scan after the original artwork that it matches. Importantly, the parameters for what a match is, or how a match is determined, are entirely designed with a mind for machine legibility and not human readability, right? So, as you'll see in a second, a match that the system identifies isn't necessarily human readable for us. The original and the scan might not look like each other from our perspective, from a human perspective, but the AI system believes that it does. Now, the reason I'm using this example in this context of AI adjudication is, of course, that one artist whose work was presumptively copied by the system ended up suing Adam Bazanta for copyright infringement for actually a quite substantial sum of money of almost 150,000 Canadian dollars. And this is still pending in a court in Quebec, and it's an ongoing legal struggle. So here on the left side is the scan generated by this art factory. And on the right-hand side, a photograph, a heavily manipulated photograph called Your World Without Paper, that was created by an artist named Amel Jamandi in 2009. And in the opinion of this art factory, the scan is an 85.81% match with this original. And therefore you have this, you have the title of this work. It's, I don't know if you can read it on the slide, but the title of the work makes reference to this relationship in which these two images presumptively are existing. And it's on the basis of this that Amel Jamandi sued Adam Bazanta. So this copyright complaint about Adam, there's a lot more to say about it. I will skip this maybe. What I want to focus on instead is a discussion of this tactical element of the work, because of course the system is designed to provoke these seeming matches and kind of throw them out into the world. So what the project does very beautifully is to expose this absurdity of the conservative idea about authorship or also cultural ownership that would manifest strategically through tools such as content ID. The algorithmic adjudication that content ID as a tool executes works strategically to produce allegations that cannot easily be contested. Many of you might have found this when you've tried to upload something to YouTube, and before it ever even goes online, it disappears and is flagged for probably a very bad reason, like there's maybe some incidental music playing in the background on a radio or something, or many other reasons that might actually violate your fair use or fair dealing right to upload and publish this creative expression, which the system just cannot understand and cannot accommodate. So, content ID works strategically, it produces allegations that are very difficult to contest. And a project like All We'd Ever Need Is One Another, on the contrary, works tactically to provoke infringement allegations that are not easily justified. And this is still ongoing in court, and it's going to be a hell of a hard of a time for Jamel Amandi to prove that this is indeed a copyright infringement. I think it's probably intuitively seems absurd to you, I hope, as it does to me. So what Bazantes does is he undermines conventional approaches to copyright by injecting a very complex notion of relational, dialogic, embedded authorship and creativity into his AI system. And what this really brings about is that it actually provides him, the way he uses AI actually provides him with a number of quite reasonable defenses against these copyright infringement allegations. And one of them could be for the artist to say, I didn't do this. The algorithmic processes by which these works are generated they are sandboxed so carefully and shielded from me so well that I have absolutely no creative agency in generating the image, or also in finding the match, or also in naming the piece and then putting it online. This is all happening more or less autonomously. So I think very reasonably the artist could here argue, a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but nevertheless, could argue that it just does not make any sense to describe him as the creator of this piece. And therefore, it also makes very little sense to accuse him of infringing a copyright of another artist. What this points to, in my mind, is that Adam Bazante in this project plays with this notion of a very complex assemblage of expressive agencies. He might be one of them, but the scraper tool is another. This array of flatbed scanners is another. So it really becomes kind of an interesting post-humanist entanglement of expressive agencies of which he is a part, but that certainly could not be accommodated by the very straightforward notions of authorship and copyright ownership that the law is, for the most part, working with. So this is raising interesting philosophical questions that I've already noted earlier about what it means to be a creator or to create something, or what makes a work of art in an AI context. But it also raises very practical questions. And these have to do with, for example, the legitimacy of data scraping, with a huge gray area of concerning corporate data mining for purposes of machine learning or AI training purposes. This is something that intellectual property law internationally currently has no idea what to do with, whether it's permissible or not permissible, and so on. And yeah, so all of these are issues of computational agency in relation to notions of authorship that are maybe no longer functional or no longer very meaningful in this newly emerging context of presumptively creative AI. So overall, the project, to me, I think a good way of summing it up would say that it contaminates this relatively rigid system of IP law with a very dynamic and a very fluid idea of creative agency. And the result, again, is this type of bias contagion that can help expose very serious issues with algorithmic adjudication. So in this discussion of putting side by side Adam Bazante's piece and the content ID tool, I focused specifically on authorship questions, on copyright questions, but I think it's also possible to trace this idea of bias contagion into very different contexts. And there are many relevant examples of AI art projects and practices where artists proceed, again, similarly by injecting data into existing AI or machine learning ecologies, and by kind of tactically infecting these ecologies of commercialized, normalized, biased, proprietary data, injecting it and infecting it with critical difference. Always, at least with an implicit focus on facilitating critical literacy of data, of critical literacy of underlying AI and machine learning technologies. So one of these examples, I put this slide up now, and Maya also is here, is this very fascinating, to me, wonderfully interesting art project called Non-Brute Force. I highly recommend maybe you talk to Maya about it directly rather than hear me try to describe it. And also go see the newest iteration of the project that's exhibited at the JKU University campus. But in essence, the way I bring it into play here, let me just tell you about one detail of the project. One aspect of it is that there is a collection of biometric data or vital signs and signals of a dog that are then uploaded and injected in the largely black box and proprietary data ecology of the Apple Health platform. And this, of course, is a collection of biometric user data that partly works towards offering AI-driven recommendations for, healthy behaviors and workout routines and so forth. But this uploading of alien or foreign data, this contagion of this environment with this data, allows for really very intriguing reflection, again, first of all, of data ownership and algorithmic adjudication, but then also about speculation concerning the potential unforeseeable effects that this contamination of the Apple Health ecology might have. What kind of bias contamination can the dog data trigger when it infects the Apple Health platform? What strategic biases are here being exposed in that process? And what tactical biases might here be injected into the existing data environment? For a second example, and I think this is my last slide, I could point to Jake Elway's and an ongoing project called ZZ, which Rosemary already mentioned earlier on. Jake's work, and actually I think he's at Ars Electronica as well, and there was some kind of online event related to this project earlier on this afternoon. It's in a way about queering AI. The work enacts a very deliberate tactical queering of dataset politics, again problematizing the normative aspects of established perspectives on agency. And so this project in particular revolves around AI-based generation of gender-fluid, androgynous drag performers. And this is done partly by, again, injecting alien data into existing data sets. So injecting difference, in this case, into biased normative data ecologies. Specifically, Jake uploaded or included 1,000 images of drag performers into a large mainstream data set that's often of portraits that is often used for machine learning purposes. And the resulting outputs, and this is an example of that, they very powerfully expose the biased assumptions concerning gender identity that tend to be encoded in these mainstream training data sets that are commonly being used for AI-based image generation. So the ZZ project shows that in strategic modes of practice, dataset bias is very likely going to accentuate and perpetuate and even amplify normative sameness. When we see an AI-generated portrait, and it just looks so real, and oftentimes that means it looks like a bland version of everybody else. And that's precisely not what the purpose is here, or the goal is here. So whereas in strategic modes of practice, the sameness is accentuated and amplified, and a lack of diversity is kind of normalized, what happens here is that this is very powerfully exposed. ZZ in that way kind of shows very much in line with the aesthetics and politics of drag overall, that there's a radical difference that can be provoked when bias contagion can be mobilized tactically. So to wrap it up, there's no doubt that one crucially important ambition within contemporary digital art practice and discourse is to highlight, expose, and if possible, eradicate systematic or systemic biases in AI and machine learning. But the train of thought that I've been following here is that perhaps another important ambition should also be to mobilize the concept of bias contagion critically, to focus not only on ejecting bias from AI systems, but simultaneously also to focus maybe on injecting critical counterpoints to the kinds of biases that we can see at work everywhere around us. And so in this sense, the question to end on is, how can this work at scale in a bigger sense? And maybe where can we see this phenomenon of critically deployed bias contagion, bias contagion already at play? Thanks.
Thank you very much, Martin. We now have the chance to reply to you. And I would like also to bring all the speakers from today to the stage again. We have some chairs prepared here on the side. So please, Ian, please, Kleanthis. I mean, I know that you immediately have something to reply. Who else was here? Rosemary. Please. But also the audience. And Maya. Maya, do you want to add something? I mean, your work was here on display.
Well, maybe later, because unfortunately I was not able to attend from the beginning. So, but I would gladly add when the debate is going to be more. Yeah.
Anybody else?
Volunteers for the roundtable. That's what she's looking for.
Yeah, there is Michelle missing. Too many men sitting now here. Absolutely. Actually, it's also me here.
In the program, you're supposed to be in the roundtable as well.
Exactly. I will stand here. I don't need a chair. I can sit here then also. Oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Giacomo. Yeah, I mean, I had a short talk also in between with Kleanthis, and I mean, Kleanthis, maybe I give you first also the microphone, if this is okay. We had, I mean, you are you are working with data, and especially also the projects that you presented. And so this double phase of working with data actually in the way of, okay, how to control it, which kind of data are going into a project like the Nicosia project and so on, and how to actually understand so what is actually for the good and where we have to be very, where's this kind of situation where we're actually under this biased situation and how to control them. What would be then your reply to this?
Yeah, that's a very difficult question. I mean, it's not black and white. I don't think anybody could argue here the value of machine learning and data and how this can help and contribute to the society in general. But again, on the other hand, nobody could argue if it's not somehow not controlled or regulated, but understood properly, it might get out of hand. And I'm stuck now to the last example that Martin gave about, I mean, before when you were talking, I was thinking about the content ID, but now the only thing that is stuck to my head is how biased can these algorithms be. And I mean, that's a very nice example, and it's clear. But if you go into the details of the of machine learning algorithms and how you can manipulate or how these are evolved, bias is pretty much from the beginning. It's how the weights are in those. I could give emphasis to a specific feature because that is of my interest. So by infiltrating and polluting, let's say, the data with something that it's definitely that this will happen. It's a clear thing. However, if we move towards a little bit of more transparency in the algorithms and not working with black boxes, and if we actually are aware of how everything works, maybe I think you concluded on that, if I understood correctly, that these biases can be somehow guided towards a better and more evolved machine learning and artificial intelligence world. Instead of, I mean, I don't know if it's clear what I'm trying to communicate here, but it's still, I'm feeling difficulties to expressing, but we could use the same technology in evolving that technology. And the deeper understanding of how these technologies work are the key, and the transparency in that are the key to or monitor it or regulate it or even guide it to becoming a better machine, if that makes sense.
If I can maybe respond right away, that those are a number of different responses that you're all bringing together. Regulation, monitoring, transparency, they're all very, very different approaches, aren't they? They're not very similar to one another. I mean, they're all important. I don't know if I would favor one over another, or say there needs to be a mix of those. I mean, the provocation I tried to formulate was to maybe, run with the bias if it's unavoidable. I was recently talking about a similar topic at actually a critical legal studies conference, and they did this experiment there where they used all of the papers presented at the conference to create an AI bot that was, maybe knowledgeable about critical legal theory based on all the material that was fed into it. And of course, it's not at all. It's absolute gibberish that comes out, where you can recognize maybe some fleeting moments of quotes or concepts from different theorists, but it's not knowledgeable in any form or way. But it really helps to expose that these biases are absolutely inevitable, right? And that the outcome is an amalgamation of the input. And that's not something that AI art very often exposes about itself, or not often enough. I mean, that interesting kind of AI art does so, but oftentimes that isn't really the case. I mean, the example, Rosemary, that you gave of the portrait of Edmond de Bellamy the claim that it was created by an algorithm and not by an artist, that's the absolute opposite, right? Like that's the claim that there is no human agency or bias involved, and it's completely absurd to claim that.
Maybe, when media artists and urban researchers sit on a panel, we have to decide on which common ground do we have to talk about. So whenever I hear concepts from media artists or other epistemic communities with whom I have very little touch, I translate it immediately into my own brain circuit, right? So it'll be very difficult. I can't talk about art with you for sure, but when I hear agency, when you say the loss of agency of an artist, I would think the loss of agency of a citizen, of a city. So that's the only way that I can talk, but maybe that's our common ground, right? And so if I think of, data is the gold of the 21st century, we know that. AI is the entity which is playing with data and doing something with data, transforming into services or making business models or whatever. But the essential thing that AI does, and now from the perspective of an urbanist, is taking over the decision-making processes. And when on the personal level, if I take my phone and I want to choose a restaurant, if I think, should I go to this place or that, I look it up and I see, okay, this is the frequency of visitors. I know there are fewer people here, so maybe I choose that, or Google Maps or whatever. So on a very small scale, very almost unnoticeably, our decision-making process is already influenced by algorithms. But now, if I think of, the next scale is the city brain. Now, I don't know if you know this project in Hangzhou in China, because China is ahead of all countries in all this. We know that. Hangzhou created a brain called the city brain, which was created by Alibaba. And what they do, they're doing it now. I don't have the recent information, but until 2 years ago, I was well informed about what's going on. So essentially, they are getting the entire data of the 8 million city of Hangzhou and feeding it into the black box of AI, and that's feeding back their services into the city. So they have the entire, and China, it's more accessible data of individuals. So the entire decision-making process of an entire city is driven by AI. This is what we're moving into. So that's the translation that I see of the loss of agency of an artist using AI, and I leave it to the discussion. If that's the world that we are moving into, what is our role? What is the agency of the citizens or of institutions or organizations or educational institutions?
Well, from my point of view, is the point of view of the artist. My point of view is the point of view of disrupting all the mechanism of capture of data, because as you said, it's a black box that we don't have access to it. We don't know the companies which are behind this capture of data. We don't know what, as human beings, we trust in human beings, and also we trust in technology so much. We don't know what's going on behind, So at the moment, from my citizen point of view, which is the citizen point of view of an artist, disrupting these mechanisms is the strategy and the tactic, as you like to mention, that I have found at least more funny to work with.
I think something about everything we've discussed here today so far is it continually reminds us that we're always standing on shifting sand. So we're never, just in a fixed moment of time where everything is static and everything stops, where everything is constantly, moving parts. And something that I find quite a lot in related discussions and also discussing my own work as an artist or as a researcher, dealing with these things. And I continually encounter this desire for artists to kind of solve it, or art to give, kind of solutions or answers, or to kind of break it in a meaningful way that will show us a way forward or something like that. And and I guess maybe I end up at the same point every time, like that maybe that's not what art needs to do or should do or can do. But something that came to me while I was listening to your presentation was something that Hito Starro has mentioned in relation to engaging with machine learning systems and this desire to pollute them. And I think it's kind of interesting, like that Jake Elwes's tactic of in a way, messing with a system by giving it useless data, but then or not useless data, but the data that is not intended to be in that system, or something that will offset the bias. But I think it continually creeps in, and the arguments against that I've heard are, okay, the data set is unrepresentative, so we'll make it representative. And now we can better commodify you, and we can better track you, and we can better, capture your value. And so I feel like I feel like your approach is actually it's really nice to think about this in terms of tactics, like that these are things that shouldn't necessarily be fixed, and that we can develop methodologies that are intended to change and are intended to kind of work with the flexibility and unpredictability of the context that we're dealing with as well. So I just really appreciated that very much, and I feel like it offers quite at least for me, it's a nice, graspable way of thinking about moving forward and working with AI systems.
What you're just saying about you identify this, how did you put it, like a desire for artists to solve these particular kinds of problems or find solutions. And what you were saying about this massive scale computation of the data, whatever that means, of 8 million people at a completely different scale. I wish Michelle was here, because the last provocation she had in her video was to say to make something really small out of something really big. And she might be the perfect person to tell us some tactics for how that might work, because that's really what that ends up being about, I guess, right? I mean, the problems that we can identify in how AI is instrumentalized in corporate contexts is very often about massive scale operations. But the most incisive and oftentimes radical interventions that we can see in AI art projects are oftentimes at a very different scale. And they're probably not designed to scale up. And maybe that's also an irrelevant desire to figure out how to scale it up. But it can nevertheless be maybe like you said, like a dynamic, fluid, not rigid, not fixed set of ideas about how to respond to a terrifying thing that you describe of a city brain, which we have to prevent that from happening. I mean, not speaking as an urbanist, maybe you have a different perspective as an urbanist, but.
I mean, one thing is, if we are terrified of something out of privacy, but these are all very luxurious fears. The real problem is climate change or the loss of biodiversity. In the next 20 years, we're going to lose 1 million species. This is the report, and Australia says it's much worse. I mean, there was a report in Australia. So we are facing enormous challenges in the next 20 years. And I think AI, Hangzhou, is not going to solve the problem of the planet. It's not responding to climate change. And I personally think, that very, very personal, we can discuss this, is that if we can't, power would lie with those people who can solve problems in the future. And if it's AI that can solve problems, then it's great. If it's not solving our problems, then it'll become irrelevant. And that's why I think the tactical approach is extremely important, because it's just, I mean, innovation happens only in the periphery. It never happens in the center. It's just in the big marketized world is there. It's going its way. It's like a huge ship with, with no captain on it, and it's just moving in a direction. And then we have these little boats around, getting out of the big ship maybe, and looking for new shores, and looking for new ideas, looking for new orientation. We have new maps. We have new visions. Maybe we go to a new island. We find an island. We set up our new. That's where innovation happens, and it happens with single persons. That's most incredible. I've been looking at urban innovation in the last 20 years, and all the big innovations happen in extremely small cells. So there's a lot of, and when we say about hope, I think because we have this peculiar fear, this dystopic fear about technology, that's not really it. It's like, how are we deploying technology? Like, what is the context of deployment of technology? And the fear should be more like, are we going to solve our problems with climate change? Are we going to solve our problems with our deep psychological problems in our society? I mean, if you look at, let's say, suicide rates and things like that, all these micro studies about psychology is incredible. Nobody's talking about that. So we really have issues. And then we can ask, are you solving AI? Are you solving your problems or not? It's extremely simple. And they are not solving our problems.
Yeah, but at the same time, machine learning is making efficient systems, but at the same time, it's also wasting a lot of amount of energy. This is the point where I can achieve. It's like what we want. With this. Creating this amount of technology, that as you mentioned, complexity, is like creating, it's like I always like this John Maeda sentence, like simplicity is better, but technology is always creating a layer of complexity, So at the end, we are trying to solve problems that we already have solved without this technology, Disrupting.
Let me critically close this roundtable, because we are all researchers. And I would actually close with the quotation that I have here also in the booklet from Friedrich Kittler. So in compute, and this is about like this life of a second degree, because we are researchers, and what are we doing? Our research is actually based on our time. Is our research also based on a second degree? But what is Kittler saying? So, in computers, the mechanical objectification never transforms back into a life word sense, but at best into contemplation of life of a second degree. Scientific visualization, artificial life, and so on. Universally programmable computers are so cut off from human experience that there is a danger that they would program their users as well. So we are in this life of a second degree. And we're researchers, and we're actually in danger of actually having our research of a second or even third degree. So how we are actually, what are we doing? Do you think your research is a research of a second degree?
Researching from the art side is visualizing the problems. No, it's not like solving the problem, but trying to make a piece with acting as a trigger in the brain of the audience, no? And make this connection with the problem smoothly.
So let's come out of this circle. Let's try not to be in this kind of degree discussion. But thank you very much for all your talks today and for all your thoughts and inspirations that you actually gave us. Tomorrow we will continue. Actually, it's a good time to explain a little bit the schedule for tomorrow. Tomorrow we have the laser talks, and we talk about hybrid futures. And of course, again, in reflection to our life. And we will sit here under the tree. We will have talks by, one moment, I again have to go to my booklet. Aizen, where is she? Aizen. Dr. Aizen Karo Shakin will be together with her colleague. She will be online contributing, but we will also have talks from Christa Sommerer and Fabrizio, who are actually doing the laser talk tomorrow, Diana Aiton-Schenker, Christiana Katzaku from the Laser and Leonardo Network, Christoph Thun-Hohenstein, so the former director of the MAC in Vienna, and who is actually leading the Biennial for Change, Monica Galliano, Martin Pfoser, and very local people, the Leisenhof will also participate, and Gabriele Winkler. So looking forward to the talks tomorrow, and thank you very much for your contributions today. We are not done, so we will give over the stage and the microphone and the sound experiences to Kike, Julia, and their team. And yeah, we are open until 10 o'clock in the evening. Again, we have to shut down at 10 o'clock. Very on point, very calculated time, because here is the hotel, Motel 1, and we should not disturb them after 10 o'clock. But enjoy. Now let's go to the bar, have another discussion, maybe go totally away from all these discussions that we had. Oh, I totally oversaw.
or rather two thoughts I have to all these discussions. Feeding meaningless data or destructive data might be just what the AI could need to make the picture complete. This was one of my thoughts, like understanding humans better. What are humans doing? Humans are annoying, so AI figures that out too. And the second thing was, you said that data is the goal of the 21st century. Gold. God or gold? Gold. So no? God. Gold. Okay, so then AI would be the alchemist, trying to make gold out of shit.
Anybody who wants to add something? Okay. What the fuck is critical data? Do we need data? How much data do we need for our life in future? So thank you very much for your contribution. And yeah, looking forward to see you tomorrow for next talks and handing over to the Sound Campus.